going to begin with two incidents, two stories I would like to tell, not stories really, two cases I would like to talk about, which happened a few years ago. A young mother, medical doctor, very successful doctor in her 30s, called me and said, ma'am, what happened, I know that I shouldn't beat up my children, I know I shouldn't yell and scream at them, but it is my older daughter, 7, 8 years old. Every time she clings to me, she wants me to give her a bath, or she forgets her homework, doesn't, brush her teeth. I get so upset. I start yelling, shouting, and sometimes I even hit her. I don't do this with my younger one. I only do this with my elder one. And after doing this for many days, I feel very guilty and ashamed of myself. Another lady, a very successful entrepreneur, again a mother of 2 kids, told me that after all the positive parenting stuff I have read and everything I have implemented, for the last 8-9 months, I have not yelled or hit my kids until yesterday. Yesterday, when my 4-year-old son ran after me with a broom to hit me, I don't know what happened. I just lost it. And I bait him black and blue. And after a few hours, I realized what a horrible mother I am and how could I go back to those behaviors. Friends, I'm Riri Trivedi. I'm a psychotherapist, a trainer, and a parenting coach. And today, I'm going to be talking about how our own childhood experiences determine or affect our parenting approaches and our parenting styles. So we get many such people in our clinical practice who are very functional, very intellectually sound, very wise, very well-read, very self-aware. Yet, in certain situations when they are extremely triggered, all their wisdom flies out of the window. And they end up behaving, reacting in ways which they themselves cannot understand. So this led us, about 5 years ago, 2019, led us to try to figure out why this is happening. And we came upon a whole lot of global research, 30 years of global research in the area of childhood trauma or adverse childhood experiences. We found that there were, the sample size was close to 500,000 people, and there were so much of studies done world over on how what we experience between 0 to 18 years has a lifelong lasting impact on not just our physical health, our mental health, but our relationships, including early mortality and death. What are these ACEs or adverse childhood experiences? You will see on the screen. This constitutes of everything that we experience or see or witness from 0 to 18 years of our life. So the first bucket, as you see, is household challenges. So children who grow up watching dysfunctional families where there's domestic violence, mother or father has mental health issues, there may be alcoholism, drug addiction, or if somebody in the family has gone to jail. Entire gamut of dysfunctional family or toxic family environment is one of the big causes of childhood trauma. The next 2 buckets you see is what is done directly to the child, which includes physical abuse like beating, slapping, punishing, caning, whipping, pushing, all of that. Sexual abuse, which is molestation, inappropriate touch, showing private parts, or even penetration and rape. Emotional abuse, I will talk a little bit about it, but emotional abuse also comes under childhood trauma where the child is continuously criticized, threatened, compared, nagged, humiliated, shamed, and made to feel worthless. The third bucket is about emotional and physical neglect. So if the child's emotional and physical needs are consistently not met by the parents or caregivers, that also comes under trauma. And of course, there are other 6 elements also like, bullying in school, peer isolation, witnessing community violence, going through parental separation or death. So all of this together constitute of ACE. And global research today says that anybody who has more than 4 childhood trauma incidents consistently happening between 0 to 18, they are at a very high risk of mental health issues, physical health issues, and a host of other relationship issues, etc. So we decided to summarize all this global research of the last 3 decades. And the summarization says that people with high trauma not only have a risk of developing mental health issues like I said, depression, anxiety, PTSD, BPD, physical health issues like autoimmune disorders, cardiovascular diseases, chronic issues related to chronic health conditions. They also have a high risk of high-risk behavior. So people who drink and drive, unplanned pregnancies, multiple sexual partners or unsafe sex. Children with high trauma scores are also susceptible to criminal behaviors
and they are also more likely to be prone to addictions. What research says is this is not limited to a particular generation. So trauma gets passed on generation to generation. And this is seen across developing countries. So it is not about education or money or wealth also. So when we saw that there is so much of global research in this area, we said that, okay, well, what is the research in India? And we found out, unfortunately, 5 years ago, that in India there are hardly any research papers on childhood trauma. Today, India has 400 million young population. We have the highest number of millennials and Gen Zs. And yet, in India, there are very few research papers. So I decided to pursue my doctoral studies in the area of childhood trauma and mental health. We also try to look at how neuroscience plays a role, and there is so much of research which shows that a child who goes through childhood trauma or severe childhood trauma experiences has a bottom-heavy brain, which means the part of the brain responsible for impulsive behavior, for the fear center or the amygdala, is overactivated. And the part of the brain responsible for rational logical thinking, for impulse control, for long-term planning, or for memory and concentration is underactivated. So these are the children who are hypervigilant, hyperactive, diagnosed with ADHD, and at the same time they have issues with rational thinking and impulse control. So there is a lot of studies in neuroscience as well on childhood trauma and the impact on the brain centers. And hence this led me to publish my first review paper and how this is a public health problem in India, because if childhood trauma is linked to chronic health conditions, mental health conditions, then obviously it is something we need to take seriously. So when I started my doctoral studies, I said, okay, I will do about 300 quantitative analysis of people who have childhood traumas and their mental health parameters. And because quantitative data doesn't really give insights, I said, okay, I'll do probably 100 interviews, one-to-one personal 1-hour interviews to understand how childhood trauma has impacted their adult life. Today, I'm very proud to say that after 5 years, I have almost 5 times the number of quantitative data and 10 times the number of qualitative data on this childhood trauma. So these are all the papers that we have published only specifically on childhood trauma. And some of the information I'm going to share with you today is based on the papers that are highlighted in the slide. So we also, we have about 1,500 samples where we saw consistently that all the people who came to us with high childhood trauma also had severe scores on depression, severe scores on anxiety, and high scores on insomnia, right? Which means that people with a trauma load had a much higher impact of this or severity of this versus average or versus people with low trauma scores. We also found out that people who have high childhood trauma are 3 to 7 times more likely to have severe depression and 2 to 5 times more likely to have severe anxiety, measured on the GAD scale, and depression measured on the MDI scale. So these are the globally recognized scales. So this was consistent, which matched with the global data that we had. We also studied suicide behaviors because we are seeing suicide is a huge problem in India today. And even all the people who came to us with self-harming behaviors or suicide behaviors, which include suicide ideation and suicide attempt, also had significantly high childhood trauma scores. What you need to note is this is correlation, not causation. So this does not mean that everybody who has high trauma will think of committing suicide. This means that everybody who has attempted or thought of suicide definitely have high trauma present in their life, right? So we must understand that this is a correlation. So consistently we saw how childhood trauma has a huge role to play in the adult health. Then we found out, we asked ourselves that, okay, out of all the 16 elements, let's try to understand which are the most toxic, right? Everybody says, okay, well, physical abuse, bullying. But surprise, surprise, when we did our research, we found out that it is not physical abuse, it is not sexual abuse, but it is emotional abuse and neglect that are the most toxic and that are significantly related to onset of depression. Yeah, emotional abuse and neglect. Even when we looked at the suicide group, we found out a very high prevalence of emotional abuse and neglect, which is what led us to further study what is emotional abuse. Emotional abuse, in our culture is very normalized. In fact, sometimes it is glorified also as far as parenting goes. People don't understand these terms. They think they are very Western terms. But emotional abuse, because it is subjective, it cannot be measured. Most parents do not even recognize that they are being emotionally abusive. But it includes everything that you see on the slide, which is constantly criticizing, threatening the child, humiliating, making the child feel ashamed, with the, of course, intention to improve the child. But the intention doesn't affect here. So again, body shaming, nagging, comparing, even forcing a child to be a mediator between the parents' fights. Yeah, or forcing a child to be a caretaker of a sick parent or a sibling also amounts to emotional abuse. And emotional abuse has been linked to low self-esteem, low self-worth, which leads to depression, loneliness, and eventually self-harming and suicide behaviors. So these are really serious issues that we need to think about, and we again published a paper on that as well. So if you see, even in the qualitative data that we took, we sat with the clients for an hour, hour and a half, and we understood qualitatively. Consistently, we found out that those who went through chronic trauma or severe stress in childhood had volatile and highly triggering behaviors. Yeah, they also had disconnected relationship with their parents and immediate siblings or family members. They also tend to be, like I said, making irrational decisions. So the decisions were more from running away from the toxic environment than a rational decision. So these are the people who made irrational decisions about marriages, careers, finances, etc. Emotionally driven, impulsive decisions. If you recollect the brain slide, I had showed you how the impulse generation center is overactivated, impulse control center is underactivated, which explains this. Also, unreasonable fears and phobias, addictions, and chronic health conditions, including eating disorders. Eating disorders, obesity, and binge eating is also linked to childhood trauma. So this is just a summary of the psychopathology of childhood trauma, that it encompasses almost every aspect of our life, and yet, unfortunately, we do not take it that seriously. Linking back to the first two cases I told you about, right? The lady who was a medical doctor who got triggered by her older daughter, her story was this, that as a child, she was continuously bullied. She was given up by her parents to be brought up by her grandparents, so there was abandonment, emotional neglect. She was called a buffalo, she was called dark, she was body shamed, and she grew up feeling extremely worthless and useless, until a point in life when she decided to completely change over and become this perfectionist, achiever, go-getter medical doctor. So she hated her childhood self. Now, when this 8-year-old daughter of hers started showing the behaviors of her own childhood self, she got extremely triggered. And all the anger she had for her own childhood self were now directed at her daughter. In case of the second lady, who was an entrepreneur, she grew up with a very high trauma score. So she had sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse and neglect, toxic family environment. But most importantly, she grew up seeing domestic violence. And regularly her father used to hit her mother with a broom. So when her 4-year-old son ran after her with a broom, that triggered an unreasonable response. A logical mind knew that this is just a little boy running, but the memory of seeing her mother being beaten by a broom regularly triggered a completely unreasonable response. So this is how all our experiences. Now we must remember that our experiences are stored in our body as long-term memory, implicit and explicit memory. And research says that implicit memory does not change over time, which means that your body carries the memory of everything you have gone through, whether you recollect it or not, right? And hence, when these children now become adults and become parents, what happens? Yeah. So these are the children who have a bottom-heavy, trauma-ridden brain. Their nervous system is dysregulated because of chronic stress and trauma, and now they become parents. What happens in such situations? One is, there is a whole group of children who, because of trauma and stress, become completely numbed out, disassociated, disconnected. So as parents, they are uninvolved parents or negligent parents. They may be taking care of all the physical, intellectual needs of the children, but they are emotionally unable to connect. They are unable to read the emotional cues of the child. They are unable to make that emotional connection with the child or with the spouse. The second group of the parents are the ones who will say that well, my parents brought me up with this kind of beating and punishment and I grew up fine, so my children will also be brought up in the same way. So these are the parents who continue the same pattern of authoritarian parenting, where they are using punishment and violence and hitting and beating and shouting and screaming and abusing and criticizing to raise up their children. And the third group of parents get polarized. So these are the parents who say, well, I grew up with so much trauma and abuse, I don't want my child to go through that. So what will I do? I will raise my child with full permissiveness. I will, these are the parents who raise pampered, entitled kids. No rules and regulations, no boundaries. My child is a boss of the house. He's my friend. He decides where we go on a holiday. My child will never fail. My child will do what he wants. The teachers cannot tell him anything. Research says that all these three styles of parenting are not good for the child. Authoritarian style is where there is high control and low responsiveness. Helicopter parents, overprotective parents, authoritarian parents. Negligent is where you are completely not interested, child grows up on their own. Permissive parents is where you raise entitled, spoiled, pampered kids. The best parenting style is authoritative parenting style, where you have a good mix of rules, regulations, discipline, and at the same time responsiveness towards your child's feelings and emotions. There is two-way communication. Again, the study we did said that parents who have high trauma history are unable to be authoritative parents. They invariably have higher scores on either authoritarian, negligent, or permissive parenting. So even the balanced ideal parenting style is very difficult for parents who have gone through trauma as children, because their nervous system is dysregulated, their body is dysregulated, and mind is not balanced. So what can we do as parents? As parents, I know this is a group of young people, but my talk is more for parents. Please be aware of what your past baggage is and how that may be impacting your interaction with your children and with your spouse. Once you are aware, first step is done. Okay? After that, you can use self-regulation techniques or even therapy to take help to overcome this. Because remember, this is a dysregulated system. If you learn regulation techniques, a lot of it can be resolved. Techniques that include humming, chanting, breathing, etc. And the third thing is that after you have done this, you will be able to use the positive parenting tools that are available through books and workshops. We also again did a study and found out that parents who went through 1 month of self-regulation techniques coupled with a few hours of awareness talks, after 4 weeks they reported less anger, less aggression, and better confidence at being parents with their children. So again, this is backed by the studies we have done. For those parents who cannot heal themselves with self-regulation techniques, therapy also helps. As you see on the slide, these are the stories of two parents who've said that when I healed my own childhood trauma, when I healed my own past, I was able to better connect to my child. I was able to have a closer relationship with my child. So parents who bring us, their children and say, fix my child, we always say, please work on yourself first. Because when parents work on themselves, most of the times children do not need any sort of therapy. Okay? So what can we do as parents? First thing is understand and acknowledge our trauma baggage. Second thing is, you do not have to live with trauma all your life. You do not have to be a victim, because your brain is continuously changing. There is neuroplasticity. So with every changed experience, your brain neural pathways are changing. So if you change your experiences, you can change those files and programs. If you work on yourself, use self-regulation techniques, use therapy or expert help, you can definitely change from the point you decide to change. This is very much possible. And for this, as students, you have to normalize conversation around mental health with your parents, and parents need to normalize these conversations with their children. So last but not the least, healing our own wounds isn't just self-care, it is the greatest gift that we can give to our children. Thank you so much for patiently listening. I see that I finished in 18 minutes and that was my target. I hope this was useful and I hope you take back some lessons.